3,000 Liberal Party members are gathered in Halifax for a national convention there. It's the last one before next year's federal election. Members of the Trudeau cabinet are talking with delegates about a number of key issues. That includes the government's backing of the Trans Mountain pipeline. And we're learning that Ottawa thinks if indeed Kinder Morgan somehow walked away, that some other company would step in to fill the void. Now, for more on this hot mess, we're joined by Martha Hall Findlay, CEO of Canada West Foundation, and Dennis McConaghy, author and former executive at TransCanada. Dennis, I'll start with you. What do you make of this claim from the Liberals that if Kinder Morgan walked, hey, we've got other companies that could walk right in and pick this up and we just continue along tickety-boo?
Well, I think it will be a very difficult process to get this pipeline built on the time frame that it needs to be built in if there's any other way of trying to do this than to get to the finish line with Kinder. So I don't think very much of the idea of trying to bring in new partners at this juncture or trying to effect a transfer to some other entity, because the basic issues related to completion risk are still out there for regardless of what private sector player is involved. And at this moment, I think it is all going to come down to the next 4 or 5 weeks as to whether the federal government can deal with this completion risk that I'm sure Kinder has articulated exactly what it is that they need, and it's probably going to take the form of some kind of financial backstop if Kinder reaches some kind of impasse, probably related to the courts, between now and when they would get this thing constructed.
And Martha Hall Findlay, I want to ask you about federal investment into this, because you've written eloquently on that. But before we get to that, just quickly, what do you make of this notion that some other company could somehow step in?
The really quick answer is if it ends up not being viable from a business perspective for Kinder Morgan, I can't see that it's viable from a business perspective for anybody else. The issue here is not who owns it. The issue here is that we can't get it built, at least not yet. And whoever owns it, that continues to be the problem.
Okay, so now let's turn to the government funding of this, because they've said they could invest in it maybe, or sort of throw some money at it to sort of de-risk it somehow. Martha, you first. What are the concerns that you have about federal money being used like that in this instance?
One, I think it sets a terrible precedent. One of the problems that we have is we don't have any kind of overarching policy in terms of what's in the national interest. We don't have any overarching policy of what pipelines we're going to say yes to and which ones we're going to say no to. There's an incredible level of uncertainty in the country, and that's a whole other conversation, Peter, about what this is doing to our investment climate. But it sets a very bad precedent that we have a government that, rather than setting policy and strategy and saying this is what we're going to do, all of a sudden they're going to react to one member of the private sector, and without any kind of real reasoning behind it other than we have clearly a delay. And what I think is really important is that Kinder Morgan first said, of the two conditions, of the two concerns, said our shareholders need to know, we need to have assurance that we're going to get this pipeline built. The second one was, and we also want to make sure that our shareholders are kept whole. Well, frankly, if we can get the pipeline built, then the shareholders will be kept whole.
And Dennis, the federal government has the legislative authority to do this if it deems it to be in the national interest, to get this thing built and get it done. Kinder doesn't need money, does it?
Well, here's the thing that I think you and all the viewers need to understand. The issue is not how economic this project is once it's in service. It is an imminently economic project once it's in service, once it is built. The risk is completion risk. And even though the Canadian government is going to bolster its ability to deal with certain kinds of risks through this legislation, they still face other kinds of risks, the project does, which is true regardless of who owns it, which is the intervention, the perverse intervention of certain Canadian courts that could cause some kind of fundamental do-over, which would cause delay, untenable interest costs, untenable trying to redo all of the accumulated approvals that it has. So this is about completion risk. And that's the risk the federal government is going to have to financially take off the backs of Kinder or any other private capital if we're going to salvage this project.
But fundamentally, the courts so far have actually upheld the concept that this is clearly a federal undertaking under the Constitution. I mean, there's much talk about declaratory power, and even I have written, let's set up a new federal act that makes it clear. Some would say that's redundant because it already is clear that it's a federal undertaking. But in some ways, and this is also of real concern, I guess, don't ever let a good crisis go to waste. We are facing a constitutional crisis here. We do have a premier in this country clearly flouting constitutional law. He got a legal opinion to that effect after he was elected, and now he's changed his tune. Now he's going down the, shared environmental thing. But we know that the goal is to stop the project. And the concern that I have, and this is the only way that I'd be supportive of some kind of intervention to get it happen, is we want the pipeline built because the pipeline needs to be built. But if Kinder Morgan walks, if the pipeline doesn't get built, then we will have lost a huge opportunity to finally clear the air from a legal perspective. The country needs legal clarity. Foreign investors, domestic investors need clarity, and they need certainty.
Dennis, you've been in these boardrooms. Do you think Kinder Morgan's really going to walk?
I think it's entirely possible that they could walk.
Really?
Absolutely. And I think that the test of this, just to elaborate on what Martha just said, I'm less concerned about the constitutional paramountcy of the federal government. What I am more concerned is some court second-guessing the amount of consultation, the terms of accommodation that have been in place to date, and saying, this court thinks there should be some do-over of all of that.
Right.
And that is something this country absolutely has to move past and find a way of clarity on what is acceptable consultation and accommodation for First Nations. And that to me is actually the bigger risk, and it's one of the risks that hangs out in this looming federal appeal court decision. And I think it was a major factor in the unease that that motivated Kinder to put down the ultimatum that they did 2 weeks ago.
All right, I'm going to have to leave it there, but thanks to you both. Some really good insight there. Martha Hall Finley, CEO of Canada West Foundation, and Dennis McConaughey, former executive of TransCanada. Thanks to you both for doing this.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.